All right, so then, good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening, good evening, thank you. And here we are for week number 2. Okay, a few little opening notes. So first of all, this is a special note to those on Zoom. Last week, there were some technical difficulties with the Zoom. And for the first half hour of the class, I wasn't even able to hear you guys. It's part of what happens. So just want to give you guys an apology, and God willing, it will be better. Okay, and here we are, lesson number 2. Want to begin by thanking our course sponsors, Nancy Trias, Beth and Eli Morocco, and Toby and Larry Fox. Thank you for sponsoring this course, bringing this course to all of us here in the community. And here we are. There you go. Thank you. Lesson 2. Here we are. We're moving on in the story, lightning strike. So they say a line that if you want to keep your friends, just don't talk about 2 things. Don't talk about religion and don't talk about politics. And I'm already down on one. So one of the downsides of my job, which is one of the reasons why I don't talk politics. But today's class, we're going to be going there. So God willing, it's all going to work out. Hello, Logan. How you doing? Yeah, let's make space for you. Come on. You want to move one seat over, Marion? There you go. No. You're right there. Come on. You don't have to sit in the back tier, in the gallery or something. By the way, this is vegan. Today's refreshments. So enjoy. On Zoom, we still didn't figure out the technology, but you're missing out on the snacks. Lightning strike. Here we go. Last week we spoke a lot about the days, the weeks, the atmosphere before the war. And today the war is going to begin in today's narrative. I'll let the video do all the talking, but last week's class was a very important premise. What was last week? That our approach to Israel, our approach to defending the land of Israel, and our approach to Israel for this entire course is not that this is a land that is important for us, even historically. It's not because we have the legal right to be there. And it's not because of Jewish survival. This is very, very personal, as I spoke about last week. I'll just tell you a little story, which I think captures the essence of what we spoke about. So in 1936, 1937, there was a lot of friction, I guess, or more than that, between the Jews and the Arabs who were living then in what was known as Palestine, the British Mandate for Palestine. There were a lot of riots. It was very dangerous for the Jews. And the British, who were then had the mandate from the UN to be in Palestine and to govern over Palestine, understood that this is a big problem. You got to figure out this issue here. So from Britain, they sent a committee to investigate, and they spent weeks and months and months. Maybe one of you know for how long it was. It was very long. It was known as the Peel Committee. Lord Peel was the head of the committee, and he had different lords. He had lawyers, he had judges from England who came and were there to investigate what is happening in Israel. So there's a whole panel, the Peel Committee, 1936, 1937, and they interviewed the leaders of the Jewish community, of the Arab community, and as well as many of the British officers who were there. And in the room, I believe it was in Tel Aviv, if I'm not mistaken, where the Peel Committee was, the room had 3 books in it on the table. A Torah, a Chumash, a Tanakh, the Jewish Bible, a book of the New Testament, and a Quran. And before each person gave testimony to the Field Committee, they all had to give an oath, right? Just like so. The Jew on the Tanakh, the British on the New Testament, and of course the Arabs on the Quran. Mr. David Ben-Gurion, who would later go on to become Israel's first prime minister, was interviewed, and actually towards the end of the commission, towards the end of the investigation. And he gave a 4-hour presentation about, what's the Jewish position on being here in the homeland, and practically what are the issues and how to deal with them. Mr. Peel, after Ben-Gurion gave a 4-hour presentation, turns to Mr. Ben-Gurion and says, "Can I ask you a few questions?" Ben-Gurion says, "Of course, ask away." So he says, where were you born? Where were you born? So he names some European town. Where is this town? He says in Poland. So Mr. Peel says it's very, very interesting. All the Arabs that I've interviewed here over the past few months were all born here. This is where they're from. For some reason, all the Jews, literally almost all of them, come from Poland, come from Russia. Don't come from here. So Mr. Peel says, look, legally, when somebody comes to somebody else's house, and Tom, you made this point last week, somebody else, and says, this is my house. You're living here, but it's my house. Maybe you're right, maybe you're wrong. You can't just evict somebody just because you said it's your house. You have to show a proof of ownership. He says, where's your document? Where's your document that this is yours? You want to come here and tell these people they got to leave? Where's your document? And Mr. Ben Gurion immediately points to the Tanakh and says, to the Bible, and says, this is our document. And this is the best document in the world. This is our title, this is our deed. Because everybody in the world knows about it. God gave this land to Abraham, then to Isaac, then to Jacob, and to the 12 tribes. This is our. That was his answer. And that was it. Mr. Peel didn't have any. But here we are, dear friends, 1967. Let us watch the video for today. After the video, we'll do a little bit more discussion and we're going to get into today's topic. Here we go. The video for today. We'll see you in a minute.
In May of 1967, Israel felt an Arab noose slipped around its neck. Egypt, Syria, and Jordan mobilized their modernized armies for synchronized war, with the backing of much of the entire Arab world and the Soviet Union. The Arab states broadcast their intention of fully annihilating Israel's inhabitants. Acting on deliberately false Soviet intelligence that Israel had mobilized to attack Syria, Egypt rolled its forces into the Sinai Peninsula on May 16th. All that kept the Israeli and Egyptian foes apart was a delicate line of blue. The UN's first attempt at armed peacekeeping. But on the same day, Egyptian President Nasser ordered the peacekeepers to abandon Sinai, clearing his path to the Israeli border. Upon receiving Nasser's demand, UN Secretary General U Thant did the unthinkable. He failed to consult the UN Security Council. He failed to ask Egypt to reconsider. He even failed to stall for time in the hope of resolving the crisis. Instead, he ordered his peacekeepers to immediately withdraw from Sinai. Israel's foreign minister, Abba Eban, subsequently complained to the UN. What is the use of a United Nations presence if it is in effect an umbrella which is taken away as soon as it begins to rain? Indeed, the region seemed closer than ever to an apocalyptic downpour. Israel was horrified by the UN's hasty withdrawal, but a contemporary CIA assessment insisted that Nasser was just as shocked that the UN had failed to call his bluff. John Hatton, the CIA chief in Israel in 1967, reported,
For me, it was just like a little boy who's being held by his father, and the little boy is shouting, let me at him, let me at him. And he doesn't want to be let at him at all, but all of a sudden the father lets go of him. Nasser was being held by his shirt tails by having this UN front. And when he demanded that it disappeared, and no one was more surprised than he, I think.
On May 23rd, Egypt blockaded the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping in a deliberate attempt to provoke military conflict by effectively laying siege to Israel, which was now cut off from its primary oil supply route and its trade routes with friendly Asian and African states. Such a move was an act of war under international law, and Israel could not afford a prolonged blockade. As the noose began to tighten, Minister Eban described his country as breathing only with a single lung. As the Middle East tottered on the brink of anarchy, a panicked Israel pleaded with foreign countries and agencies to intervene, but was met with deafening indifference. It sent Minister Eben and Mossad chief Meir Amit on frantic missions to America and Europe in search of a diplomatic solution. The UN Security Council refused to take Israel's existential concerns seriously. An Emergency Security Council meeting insisted upon by Canada and Denmark ended with no clear conclusion. Its necessity repeatedly questioned and mocked by participant members. Thought did make a report regarding the withdrawal of UN forces and expressed concern. No actions were taken as a result. France refused to acknowledge any acts of aggression on Nasser's part. Instead, it strongly cautioned Israel not to strike preemptively. Britain offered sympathy for Israel and outrage against Egypt, but no action was forthcoming. And the United States, Israel's most important ally, refused to pledge to defend Israel militarily, even if it were attacked. It then tied Israel's hands by warning sternly that it would not support Israel at all if Israel conducted a preemptive strike, albeit in self-defense. Instead, the United States attempted to rally international support for a peaceful reopening of the Straits of Tiran by sailing an international flotilla through the blockaded canal. But its efforts were met with the same collective reluctance that only 2 decades earlier had silently abetted the murder of 6 million of Europe's Jews. Israel would have to break the noose on its own, despite being vastly outnumbered and facing enemies at every front. But could it? Desperation is the mother of resourcefulness. Israel's military calculated that the side that struck first had the most realistic chance of winning. They reckoned that surprise and air supremacy were the twin keys to the conflict, and developed a bold but risky plan. At precisely 7:14 a.m. on June 5th, almost every Israeli warplane took off, leaving only 12 behind to protect the country. They flew low across the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, slipping beneath Egyptian radar and under the range of anti-aircraft batteries, and arriving precisely while the enemy pilots were busy with breakfast. In wave after wave, following brilliant strategy, they attacked Egypt's numerous airfields across the length and breadth of the country, returning to Israel to refuel and rearm at the unprecedented speed of just 7 minutes. Israel destroyed the colossal Egyptian Air Force of some 300 planes and disabled its runways and air defenses in just 2 hours. Operation Focus, or Miftzah Moked in Hebrew, formally started the 1967 war. But it gave Israel the coveted element of surprise, so that it needed not fight on its enemy's terms. It spared her from the potential loss of her own airfields and from painfully lopsided dogfights in the air. It ripped the carpet from beneath Nasser's feet and prevented him from blitzing Israel's civilians in fulfillment of his apocalyptic pledge to annihilate every last Jew in Israel. Most critically, Israel's preemptive strike enabled its Air Force to fully support its troops and armored units on the ground, a factor most favorable to the outcome of the war in the furious days that followed.
That's the story. And you know, if you read up about it, it was such an unbelievable operation. The video, you know, is actually not accurate. Maybe when the video was made, they should have had access to this information. Israel planned this operation in 1962, 5 years earlier, because they knew that nothing is calm with Egypt. It's only a matter of time. And they assigned a few, I don't know what the rank was, 2 officers to plan it. And the genius of the planning of this operation was unbelievable. And I read up about it in advance of this course. They wanted to get, I believe there were 8 airfields that Israel wanted to attack, all within literally the exact same second. 15 total. Okay, there we go. And what Israel needed was every single plane, every single formation to arrive at their place at exactly the right seconds, like that. Across entire Egypt, they're caught by surprise. It was an unbelievable success. And within the Israeli military brass, they said, while the planes were in the air, they did not know if this is going to work out. They said, if this war, what's going to determine this war is only going to be something that happens in under 1 minute. In under 1 minute, we're going to know if we win or lose. It's going to take under 1 minute. And in the what's called the pit, which is where in Tel Aviv, where the generals were gathering while this operation was happening in the early hours, morning hours, they said we won the war. That was what they said. They knew that there's a hard battle up ahead, but in their minds, this was it. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit what happened afterwards. What happened afterwards is that nothing was that simple. The world, very predictably, not a lot changes in 55 years, attacked Israel. You started first. You took the first time. Now, of course, the crazy thing is that the world was saying, no, how could you go? And, we were trying to help you. How could you go and start the war? Which is, Israel gets it's a double-edged sword. Before the war, everybody says they don't want to help you. They went to France. France gave a pledge to Israel in 1957 that they're always going to protect Israel's waters. So Israel went to them after May 16th when Egypt blocked the Strait of Tiran and said, where are you? Where are you to defend us? So the French said, it's now 1967. 1967 is not 1957. Israel went to America and they said, we have a piece of paper you signed. The State Department promised they're gonna come to our protection. Can you imagine what the American government said? We can't find that document. We can't find it. And you have to realize this is one of the most friendliest administrations in Israel's history. And this is still what they're dealing with. But the world came on quick and furious with condemnations. This is a quote from the British Foreign Office. They said it was reprehensible of them not to wait for the efforts we and others were making to extricate them. It's like crazy. This is what happened. This decision brought so much hope to the Israeli people. It unified the people. One of the beautiful things that happened in the Six-Day War, which I don't know if it ever happened since. I don't think it ever happened. It unified the people. There was even a unity government that was formed just a few days before the war began. And you had the biggest enemies and opposites within the Israeli political world sitting together in such unity when, the Jews felt that this could be a potential Holocaust at hand. And they came together with such a love and devotion to each other, and as well as the people. There was and this galvanized the people, and there was so much hope in the air. And this is definitely what brought the war to its successful end. But it haunted Israel. It haunted Israel for years. And I want to talk about what happened a few years later, 1967. Egypt didn't just lose the war, they were humiliated. And it was then a different prime minister or president of Egypt, now was Sadat. And he knew that he has to reclaim the pride of Egypt. 1974, Yom Kippur War. 1973, that's right, 1973. So just a few years later, 1973, a few years later. Before the Yom Kippur War, the Israeli government had multiple reports, They knew that an attack is imminent. They knew in the weeks in advance, they even knew a day in advance. They got direct notice from the king of Jordan, King Hussein I think was then, right? And he told Israel directly. He was then not in such good terms with Egypt, and he says, I know for a fact, Egypt is planning to attack you. And Golda Meir, who was then the prime minister, says we will not attack first. Because she wanted to look righteous in the eyes of the world. And they knew, and she knew, the entire Israeli cabinet and defense brass knew that they are putting lives on the line. They knew that they're gonna have to pay with blood for this decision, but we can't have the world look at us and say we are the aggressors. And you could even say till today, this decision from 1967 continues to haunt Israel. Israel sometimes is so scared of its own shadow, they don't know what to do. Should we attack first? Should we not? And it's always about what's the world going to say. It's a little bit of a long reading, but I want to read a bit of a long text with you because I think it's an important text. And I want to contrast these two wars. We have, on the one hand, the Six-Day War of 1967, and on the other hand, we have the Yom Kippur War of 1973. All right, we got some beautiful pictures from then. Okay, let's read this text. This is going to tell us a little bit, text 12, jump into text 12 in your books, on page 59, and I'm going to read it since it's very long. This is from an article titled Golda Meir's Nightmare. Okay, here we go. Before daybreak on Yom Kippur, October 6, 1973, Golda Meir had a bad night's sleep. She had a premonition that something dreadful was about to happen. At 4 a.m. on that 1973 Yom Kippur, the phone rang in the Prime Minister's home. Golda Meir's nightmare became a reality. Her military secretary, Brigadier General Yisrael Lior, was on the line. He told her concisely, information has come saying that the Egyptians and Syrians will launch a combined attack on Israel in the afternoon. Before she left her house that Saturday morning, Meir asked her military secretary to convene a meeting with Israel Defense Force Chief of Staff David Elazar, who was known as Dado, I believe, or Dado, I think it was Dado, and ministers Moshe Dayan, Yigal Alon, and Yisrael Galili. Participants were to gather in her office before 7 a.m., but the meeting was delayed. At about 8 a.m., two matters were brought to Meir's attention by Elazar and Dayan, the defense minister. The men disagreed about the two subjects, the scope of the reservist call-up and whether or not a preemptive strike should be ordered. The issue of whether or not to deliver a preemptive blow was more complicated. Elazar claimed that launching such a strike would save many lives. Dayan counseled that the chance of such a blow succeeding at a time when the army had yet to be called up for deployment was slight. The prime minister refused to go ahead with the preemptive strike. As Meir recalled, Dado, I said, I know all the arguments in favor of a preemptive strike, but I am against it. We don't know, any of us, what the future will hold, but there's always a possibility that we will need help. And if we strike first, we will get nothing from anyone. 3 years later, two young Jewish researchers, Stephen Rosen and Martin Indyk, right, who was the future US ambassador to Israel, wrote a study entitled The Temptation of Preemption in the Fifth Arab-Israel War. Their research probed the price paid by Israel as a result of the decision not to go ahead with the preemptive strike. Had Meir authorized such a strike against Syria's missiles and air force, the Beer wrote, it could have destroyed 90% of Syria's missile bases within 3 to 6 hours at a price of less than 10 lost Israeli planes. Clearly, this result would have had a decisive impact on Air Force losses later on. And also, and this is still more significant, on the efficiency of tens of thousands of Air Force sorties conducted during the war. Israeli fatalities on the ground would have been reduced. The wearing down of Arab artillery and of tanks and fortified vehicles from Arab armies would have accelerated, and strikes against Egypt's bridges on the Suez Canals would have been more efficient, the study argued. Kenneth Keating, the US ambassador to Israel, arrived at the Prime Minister's office while the meeting was still in session. Meir adjourned it and briefed Keating about the joint Egyptian-Syrian attack. Later, the ambassador delivered a message from Henry Kissinger. Keep that name in mind, warning Israel's government against taking the first steps to start a war. In her autobiography, Meir wrote that she was at peace with her decision, which she claimed clinched America's airlift to Israel. Indyk and Rosen, however, disputed this interpretation. In their view, had Israel launched a preemptive strike, its action would not have influenced the White House's policy, which, by the way, is true if you look back. Even after Israel waited to take the first blow, America was still not willing to send them arms until the Soviets were sending to Egypt and Syria. And then they said, oh, we're not going to let the Soviets determine the outcome of the war. Here we go, sending arms. So if you look just at the narrative of how it happened, Indyk and Rosen were right. Okay. Military historian Meir Pa'il was appointed after the Yom Kippur War to serve on a research team formed by the IDF's history department. The team was commissioned to investigate the strategic handling of the war. As Pa'il sees it, Meir was right not to launch a preemptive strike. In an interview with Haaretz, he said, could the Air Force have acted against Egypt as it had during the War of Attrition, at a time when there was a ceasefire, when we had no pretext to act, and against Syria? That morning, we did not know for certain that a war would erupt, nor did the world know about Syria and Egypt's mobilization for war. In order to engage in a preemptive strike, you need a pretext, a cause that the outside world can understand. That especially holds true with respect to the US. The world would have accused us of being paranoid. What reason would we have given to explain why we were attacking Syria? This is what happened. This is the story to the Yom Kippur War. Israel chose not to attack first, not even to mobilize its reserves. They were scared that even that would be interpreted as an act of aggression, and it was catastrophic. It was catastrophic what happened that day. Just to show you some numbers, in the 6-day war, less than 800 Israeli soldiers were killed. I believe the exact number is 777. In the Yom Kippur War, over 2,600, and I believe more than half just in the first day of fighting. For sure, in the first 3 days of fighting. The first 3 days were horrible. You could read about it. It was literally horror. You had a very small amount of Israeli soldiers who were defending the line at the Suez Canal, the Sinai Desert. Tiny amount. If I'm not mistaken, it was 90-something soldiers against the entire weight of Egypt's army. And the reserves, it was crazy. You have to call up reserves. You have to first start calling up reserves only after the attack started. On Yom Kippur. And it was very scary. And it was an absolute miracle that the Egyptians had open road to Tel Aviv, and they themselves were just too scared of moving forward, which is why they didn't go. But it was horrible. Dayan, at the second day of the war, walked into, he writes this, he walked into Golda Meir's office, and he said, now I know what it felt like by the destruction of the Second Temple, because that's what's happening to us, and another Holocaust is about to fall upon us, and there's nothing we could do about it. And Golda Meir said that she wanted to commit suicide right there and then. And Israel was about to go nuclear. He said, if this fails, that's it, we're going to go nuclear. So just to demoralize the Israeli people, the Israeli society, the soldiers felt abandoned. Many soldiers had to fight on their own initiative without even any central command guiding them heroically. It was a real mess. It was a real mess. And because of this, both Moshe Dayan, who was such a hero in the 6-day war, Moshe Dayan and Golda Meir both resigned in 1974. A few months later, once the investigations came out, and they saw that this was negligence. But interestingly, did Israel learn its lesson? I don't know. Israel still struggles tremendously with this. Do we attack first and have the whole world come out with their vengeance against us? Or should we kind of bite our lips, let them slap us on the cheek, and we'll always come in and later? And we have basically these two models, the 6-day war model and the Yom Kippur war model. Preemptively attack or wait and only do it as a response. And of course, the date remains relevant today. Hamas, Iran, Hezbollah, all of these threats are something that we're still dealing with. And of course, the question is, this is the $1 million question that we're going to be talking about today, is when is it moral, when is it right to preemptively strike? Now, that's going to be tonight's big topic. I want to first, before looking at what Judaism has to say, let's take a look at what the world has to say. What does international law have to say? In the eyes of the world, what makes a preemptive attack right? What makes it wrong? So let us begin with a very, very important text over here.
Kevin?
Yes.
As explained in the film and as you explained, the reason for deciding should we attack preemptively or not was not a moral judgment. It was a practical one based on what political effect will this have in terms of us getting the,
That was in 1973.
yeah,
Oh, but again, why are we so scared of the political fallout? Because the rest of the world looks at it and says that it's immoral.
but even if we decide that based on Jewish principles that it's moral to do it, we still have to take into effect what impact.
We have to take into effect. Let's talk about that in a moment. Let's first see what Judaism has to say. But I think the number one thing is that you have to know yourself what is the correct thing to do. That's number one. And then you can start seeing. The biggest problem comes from undecisiveness, which, by the way, was part of what did plague the Israeli cabinet and Prime Minister Levi Eshkol before the war. Okay, we'll talk about that in a moment. Let us begin with this. Text 5. Turn to your books on page 52. This is a text from the Nuremberg trials. We all know after World War II, there were the trials. 20 of the most prominent members of the Nazi leadership were tried in this trial. And the judges, in their decision, points out something very, very interesting. They said that out of all the crimes and all the atrocities committed by the Nazis, there's one which is the supreme crime, the biggest atrocity they committed. What's the biggest crime of the Nazis? Let's read text 5 and we'll start going around. I started on my right side last time, so I'll start on my left side. Larry, text 5, page 52. Here we go.
The charges in the indictment that the defendants planned and waged aggressive wars are charges of the utmost gravity. War is essentially an evil thing. Its consequences are not confined to the belligerent states alone, but affect the whole world. To initiate a war of aggression, therefore, is not only an international crime, it is the supreme international crime, differing only from other war crimes in that it contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole.
So they say that the supreme crime is waging a war. And I believe they're talking about when Nazi Germany invaded Norway under absolutely no pretense. They just go and they said that is the biggest crime. For no good reason, you're starting a war that affects the entire world. That is a supreme crime. And this is the argument why the international community, why the UN is so concerned about this idea. We can't have such a world anymore. You walk into a neighboring country and just start a war for no good reason. This is the argument. Okay, let's put that up here. So the supreme international crime, says the Nuremberg trials of 1945, is to preemptively strike for no good reason. You're just starting a war. Okay. But does this mean that a preemptive strike is never valid? No. At the same time, it could be the biggest crime. On the other hand, it could be an absolute necessity. And I want to read with you what the words of President John F. Kennedy, and when you watch the video of this televised address, October 22nd, 1962, you see in him how stress, there's tremendous tension in him. He knows he's talking to a country. This was at the beginning of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he knew that potentially it could be a nation at the brink of nuclear war. So what does John F. Kennedy say? Let's read text 6. Toby.
Neither the United States of America nor the world community of nations can tolerate deliberate deception and offensive threats on the part of any nation, large or small. We no longer live in a world where only the actual firing of weapons represents a sufficient challenge to a nation's security to constitute maximum peril. The 1930s taught us a clear lesson. Aggressive conduct, if allowed to go unchecked and unchallenged, ultimately leads to war.
There you have it. So John F. Kennedy says very clearly that no nation can accept this. A real threat is not only when the first shot is fired, but there could be other factors that come in, and it becomes negligence of a nation to not attack preemptively. Okay, so it sounds simple. Generally, don't start a war. If there's a real threat to your nation, then you got to go and strike first. Waiting around to let other people choose their timing on their schedule, that's not the way to do it. Okay, and I want to read with you. Let's go to text 11. All right, we're jumping around here. Text 11, page 58. And this is a very, very powerful text over here. Because what we're going to read over here is that even Goebbels or Goebbels, however you pronounce it, Joseph Goebbels, right? Who was the chief Nazi propaganda officer, right? What did he say? He said, I'm shocked. This is what he writes. Why did nobody attack us? What? This is what he writes. And who's writing this text 11? Henry Kissinger, the same exact person told Israel, don't you dare attack first. So that's the irony of here. Henry Kissinger, who we know was a Jew, he writes text 11, but he goes and tells Israel, don't do it. Okay, let's read text 11. Tom, would you like to read? Sure. Page 58.
No one has stated the result of the Western Allies' hesitation to confront Hitler better than Joseph Goebbels. Hitler's diabolical propaganda chief in April 1940, on the eve of the Nazi invasion of Norway, he told a secret briefing, up to now, we have succeeded in leaving the enemy in the dark concerning Germany's real goals. Just as before 1932, our domestic foes never saw where we were going or that our oath of legality was just a trick. They could have suppressed us. They could have arrested a couple of us in 1925, and that would have been the end. No, they let us through the danger zone. That's exactly how it was in foreign politics too. In 1933, a French premier ought to have said, and if I had been the French premier, I would have said it. The new right chancellor is the man who wrote Mein Kampf, which says this and that. This man cannot be tolerated in our vicinity. Either he disappears or we march. But they didn't do that. They left us alone and let us slip through the risky zone, and we were able to sail around all dangerous reefs. And then we were done and well armed, better than they, and they started the war, the Allies in the region.
So this text is a very scary text to read because it shows you the absolute danger of what happens when you're too scared to act, or the indifference of acting properly. So it seems pretty simple. This is what it seems like. If you don't have a pretext, don't attack. That's the biggest crime. If somebody's threatening you, you got to go and attack first. Sounds simple. From a Western perspective, this sounds like the formula. But as we're going to see, it's not so simple. And we're not going to get into this in today's class. But we have a appendix text, Appendix B, which is later on in your books. If you look at the international law angle, you'll see how unclear it was written, because it's a very complex issue. It seems simple, but it's not. Text 7, a text from Alan Dershowitz, from a book that he wrote about preemption, a knife that cuts both ways. And we have an article about him where he assesses the Six-Day War preemptive attack and the lack of a preemptive attack by the Yom Kippur War in the additional readings of this lesson. And Alan Dershowitz, I think he makes such a good point, and I think this really captures the lack of clarity from a Western moral perspective to this issue. Let's read text 7, page 54. Jeff, would you like to read?
There is little in the way of an accepted jurisprudence or morality of anticipatory self-defense in the military context. What we see instead are a series of ad hoc decisions made over time and place, some of which have been validated by the verdict of history, others condemned. Not surprisingly, history's judgment seems to depend in large part on whether the action that was taken turned out in retrospect to be right, rather than on whether it was justified on the basis of what was reasonably believed at the time it was taken. Since we can never know for certain how a preventive or preemptive military action will turn out, indeed, we do not even have a shared definition of success, these ad hoc verdicts of history provide little in the way of prospective guidance to what sorts of anticipatory military actions are legally or morally justified. At one extreme is the total annihilation of a perceived enemy who has taken no outward steps toward mounting an attack or even preparing for one. Throughout history, Nations and tribes have set out to destroy their enemies before they become strong enough to pose a realistic military threat. At the other extreme is waiting to be absolutely certain that the enemy is about to attack and simply beating him to the punch. That was Israel's claim when it preemptively attacked the Egyptian and Syrian air forces at the beginning of the Six-Day War of 1967.
You know, it's such a good observation, because if you look back at history and see when did the world accept, tolerate, and maybe even applaud a preemptive attack, and when did the world condemn it, is actually based on not if the decision was made in good faith, based on the information that they knew, but it's always based on the success after the fact. Was it successful afterwards? Oh, then we'll say we like it. If not, it was a horrible decision. And what he's basically saying is we don't even have a shared definition of success, and there's no accepted standard of morality when to do it, when not to do it. From a Western perspective, it's actually, there's no clarity on the issue, which is such a good point. I don't want to get into it because it's veering a little bit away from what we want to talk about today. Let's look at two examples. Let's look at a preemptive attack that the world ended up applauding and saying that was a good decision, even though initially they didn't. And let's look at another preemptive attack that now we look back and say that was a shameful act. Okay, and both of these are thorny issues. Okay, so I don't want to ruffle anybody's feathers, and I'm not taking a position on it. I'm not a political analysis, but let's go with at least what is more or less the mainstream accepted position on these issues. And I just want to move through them quickly, because that's not where we want to talk about it. Okay. A little bit closer to our time in history, 1981, Israel does another preemptive attack on the Osirak nuclear facility, which is in Iraq, a few miles out of Baghdad. Saddam Hussein is developing a nuclear reactor. He insists that's being done for peaceful purposes, right? What else, of course, right? What else would Saddam Hussein be building a nuclear reactor for? And he's getting help from the French. And Israel then goes and, in a secret mission, goes and bombs it. It was a very risky decision. It was even doubtful if the planes will be able to return properly to Israeli airspace with enough gas in their tank. It was just barely enough with adding additional. It's a very risky move. There was tremendous miracles on the way. And I've actually heard that Menachem Begin, from the moment that the pilots took off, he locked the room to his office. And until a few hours later, they're back in Israeli airspace, he did not stop pacing his room and saying Tehillim. He was reading Psalms the entire time. And only when the report came saying they're back on our space, then he was ready to emerge. It was very risky. What happened? Of course, the whole world condemned Israel horribly. Horribly. The wording that was used against Israel was very, very scary at that time. Okay. This was also one of the rare occasions where America did not veto a condemnation from the UN and supported it. The Reagan administration was horrified by this. Reagan wrote that he feels like the Armageddon is upon us right after that happened. And he was also very offended that the Israeli government didn't warn him that this is about to happen. And the entire Western world really came down on Israel hard. That's a story. Okay. So this is the Osirak reactor. The premise of the attack in 1981 was that Iraq would soon acquire nuclear weapons. And Menachem Begin, the prime minister then, for good reason, assumed that as soon as they're developed within 2 or 3 years, where are they going to be focused on? On Israel. And he famously spoke to the nation right afterwards and said, never again, he says, never again. We will always attack first whenever we feel there's a threat against Jewish survival. Okay. Let's read text 8. Didn't take long, took a few years for the world to start realizing that maybe this was the right decision. Text 8, Pam, would you like to read? Page 55. Now this from Kenneth Edelman. Kenneth Edelman, I believe, was part of the Reagan administration either then or either later. Let's see what he writes over here. Page 55.
It's the most wonderful example of preemption in the modern era was Israel's attack in June nuclear plant that would have been, they would have had nuclear weapons in Iraq's hands, but probably 1985, 1986. For my sins, I was at the United Nations when the new Reagan administration went along with the resolution in the Security Council condemning Israel for that. I'm mortified to think back at it. It was a big mistake. I thought it was absolutely right at the time to condemn Israel. Thank God Israel did that. Looking back at it, the idea of Saddam Hussein and the nuclear weapons since 1985 is quite.
I love the irony of what he says. I thought it was absolutely right at the time to condemn Israel, but thank God Israel did that. Looking back at it, I think that's that's basically a common theme throughout every single thing Israel does. You know, looking back, you say, okay, thank God Israel did that. It didn't take a few years, right? Once Iraq invaded Kuwait, everybody realized, you know what, maybe it was a good idea that this guy did not have nuclear weapons on hand. And I think this is the best part. Text 9, this from a New York Times article. Hussein himself, Saddam Hussein says, you know what? Israel was right to attack me. He himself admits that it was a good move. Richard, let's read text 9, page 56.
Mr. Hussein said he was not surprised that Israel felt threatened by Iraq, which he asserted would defeat Iran and emerge with a military that was stronger than ever. Once Iraq walks out victorious in its war against Iran, there will not be any Israel, he said in a 1982 conversation. Technically, they are right in all of their attempts to harm Iraq.
Okay. So this is our first example. Initially, the world's reaction is condemnation. All right. In hindsight, more or less, not everybody agrees on this, right? There's always going to be other voices, but most people say Israel did the right move. Even though, despite the fact that Israel, one of the harshest times of condemnation against Israel. Okay. I want to, trigger warning, okay? I want to contrast this with the Iraq War of 2003. Okay. We went and invaded a nation, America, preemptive attack. What was the premise of it? That Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction. Now, some people say that they really were. Okay, but the accepted narrative, especially of the United States, the administration of that time, the Bush administration, was we did not find any evidence. Not a single ounce of evidence was found. Again, this is the official narrative that supports this. And of course, America was very upset. The world was very upset. What's going on over here? You're just going and invading and going crazy? Let's read text 10. Okay.
On the brink of war and in front of the whole world, the United States government asserted that Saddam Hussein had reconstituted his nuclear weapons program, had biological weapons and mobile biological weapon production facilities, and had stockpiled and was producing chemical weapons. All of this was based on the assessments of the U.S. intelligence community. Not one bit of it could be confirmed when the war was over. This failure was in large part the result of analytical shortcomings. Intelligence analysts were too wedded to their assumptions about Saddam's intentions. But it was also a failure on the part of those who collect intelligence. In the end, those agencies collected precious little intelligence for the analysts to analyze, and much of what they did collect was either worthless or misleading. Finally, it was a failure to communicate effectively with policymakers. The intelligence community didn't adequately explain just how little good intelligence it had, or how much its assessments were driven by assumptions and inferences rather than concrete evidence.
Okay, so what we have over here, and the reason why I'm bringing these two examples of the Iraq War and the Iraq attack is because I want to bring home a point. That the way we, in the Western world, view all these attacks is exactly as how Al Dershowitz says it. We always judge it based on the success after the fact. Which really means, and again, even if you look at the UN international guidelines of war, it is really not clear. Yes, theoretically, preemptive attack sounds like the right thing to do under the right conditions. But what conditions have to be there? How sure do you have to be? How cautious should you be? When is it the moral thing to do? When is it the immoral thing to do? And what we're realizing is that the world, right, whatever within the world determines these things, doesn't really have a good answer for us. And I think this is one of the reasons why Israel's so scared and timid about this issue, because there are no real strong guidelines. And of course, we know there's a lot of bias against Israel. So the moment there's any opportunity to twist anything against Israel, and this is a prime opportunity. When the world itself, after decades and decades, still does not have any clarity, and is judging all these preemptive attacks in the most superficial way, based on the success or based on the information we have once it was already done, versus the intelligence we had in advance, versus was the decision made in good faith. This is why Israel's scared. Okay, after this whole long journey through this topic from a secular perspective, I want to talk to you about it from a Jewish perspective. What is the Jewish perspective on preemptive attacks, on war in general? And again, I mentioned this last week, and I want to mention it again. The defense of a Jewish community, the defense of our homeland is very important to us as a religion, where it's not just a cultural, and therefore Judaism has tremendous amount, real guidelines to teach us about these exact issues. So let's learn, and let's see where it leaves us with. Okay. So the joke goes that there was once an American, a Brit, and an Israeli that were out hiking. And they get caught by a tribe of cannibals. And they're being served for dinner that night. And they're each given a last wish. So the Brit says, I wish to die like a Brit. I want to have a cigar and a beer. Okay. The American says, I want to have a steak before I die. I want to die like a real American. And the Israeli says, I want to die like a real Israeli. Please give me a kick on my behind. So the chief, the tribe chief says, what? Give you a kick? I'm not going to do that. He says, why not? My final wish, do it. He says, give me a real good zet. Okay, so one of the tribes people come and give him a good kick. And the second that Israeli gets a kick, he pulls out an Uzi, shoots everybody, and that's it, saves all that. The American, the Brit thank him so much and say, I don't understand. If he had a machine gun on you the entire time, why don't you just go and shoot them right away? So Israeli said, and have you guys go to the UN to get condemned for attacking first? Okay, where does this joke come from? Where does this joke come from? So this is pretty recent. I just heard about this recently. Bibi Netanyahu was then young. His brother Yoni was on the front lines. They were waiting. This was in the weeks and the days before the war. And the soldiers were so antsy. Why are we not doing anything? We're under attack. Let's go attack. They wanted to fight. And Yoni Netanyahu wrote this little story, this joke, in a letter to his brother Bibi. That's where the joke comes from. Let us learn what Judaism has to say. What does Judaism have to say about war? Okay, this is the Jewish attitude to war. I want to share with you 3 Jewish values. How does Judaism look at war? First and foremost, let's begin with text 1a and text 1b. So, go ahead. We're on page 48. And Sheldon, yes, text. So read both. So one at a time. 1a. First begin with that.
Great is peace, the entire Torah was given to engender peace in the world, as it is stated regarding the Torah. Her ways are pleasant ways, and all her paths are peace. Okay,
So number 1, Judaism is all about peace. Okay, let's read the next text. 1b.
one day, Hillel would say, be of the disciples of Aaron, a lover of peace, pursuer of peace, one who loves people and draws them close to Torah.
All right, don't just love peace. We must actively pursue peace. All right. Practically, when it comes to war, this is the laws of kings and battles, the way Maimonides codifies the laws. It's shocking, right? Judaism doesn't just talk to you about the the laws of Rosh Hashanah, but there's a piece of Jewish law that says laws of kings and battles. It tells you exactly how to fight a war. So Sheldon, let's read text 2, because those are short.
That's two. War may not be waged against any human being in the world before expending an overture of peace, as it is stated. When you approach a city to fight against it, you shall offer terms of peace.
Okay, so here we have the first value, the first Jewish value when it comes to war. Number 1, love and pursue peace. Diplomacy always comes before war. You don't just go and start attacking. There's always an effort for peace. And I put here, I think appropriately, the picture of the Abraham Accords, which I think was such a beautiful moment, right? In an Arab world which used to be hostile, we have to make efforts for diplomacy and peace. Okay, that's Jewish value number 1. Now, one of the beautiful places where we see this is in the story of Jacob. Jacob has a very big run-in, and the Torah tells us the story, with his brother Esau. Without getting into too much of the whole biblical history, Jacob and Esau are twin brothers, but they're also rivals. They're absolute opposites of each other. Their father, Isaac, wants to give Esau blessing. Jacob steals the blessing. That's the story. Esau hears that Jacob, his twin brother, stole his blessing, and he wants blood. He wants to kill Jacob. Jacob runs for his life and flees to his uncle Laban, spends 35 years away from his family, away from Esau, builds a family, amasses a lot of wealth, and he thinks 35 years later, maybe it's time to go home. And hopefully after 35 years, Esau, he'll spare my life. Maybe he'll still be upset, okay, but 35 years went by. They say what time will do, even seichel won't do, right? Even common sense. Sometimes all you need is a little bit of time. So that's what so Jacob says, before I go home, let me send some messengers and feel it out. Let's read text 3a. Alan, page 49.
The angels returned to Jacob, saying, "We came to your brother Esau, and he is coming toward you, and 400 men are with him." Jacob was very frightened, and he was distressed.
Okay, so Jacob sees 35 years later, did not heal the wounds. Esau still wants blood, and he put together 400 men armed to the tooth. Okay, what does Jacob do? The Torah tells us that Jacob goes with a 3-pronged strategy. And this becomes, our sages tell us that the reason why the Torah tells us this story is to guide the Jewish people how to deal with adversary. Number 1, what Jacob did is diplomacy. Even with his enemy, Esau, who wants to kill him, his first tactic is diplomacy. He prepares gifts to appease Esau. Okay, that's the first thing he does. Number 2, he prays. That's option number 2. If diplomacy doesn't work, he has to have prayer as a backup. But option number 3, before he goes to confront his brother and his 400 men, he prepares for battle. He prepares militarily. So here we see the Jewish value. Military war is a last resort option. Diplomatic efforts, that's the first option we as Jews want to do, and that's Torah value number 1. But that also leads us to value number 2. Value number 2 is you have to prepare for war. War has to be an option. If there's a threat, prepare for war as a last resort option. And here's a picture of the days before the 6-Day War. One of the Israeli troops are getting briefed. Okay, you have to prepare for battle. 2 values. Peace first, but you have to be ready for war. If there's a threat, we're not pacifists. Okay. Take a look at the end of text 3a. Jacob gets this very frightening report. And what does it say? Jacob was very frightened and he was distressed. It's a redundancy. Very good, right. So, and in the Torah, a redundancy is like, these emergency flashes go off. Oh, that's big stuff are going on over here. The Torah, there's no place for redundancy. So we have 2 words here, frightened and distressed. What's the meaning? Let's read. Rashi, right? Our number 1 commentary who's there to explain us what's happening in the Torah, tells us like this, and Alan, you could read this text as well, 3b.
He was frightened lest he be killed. He was distressed that he might be compelled to kill others.
There we have it. 2 separate things. Frightened for his own life. And he was distressed that he may have to go and kill others. And this leads us to the third Jewish value that we have standards. We have ethical standards. We don't only have standards for ourselves, even for the enemy. Even for the enemy, we have very strong standards. And this is a clear law in the Torah. Let's read that in text 4a and text 4b. And Steve, you could go ahead and read text 4a on page 50.
When your camp goes forth against your enemies, be on guard against all forms of impropriety.
So there's you have to be careful, be on guard against all forms of impropriety. Okay, what's this impropriety that the Torah is talking about? So this is how our sages explain it. And Steve, read text 4b as well, page 51.
In my estimation, the meaning of this commandment is as follows. The Torah admonishes us to be careful at a time when sin is prevalent. The practice of army battalions is well known. They go to battle, they routinely rob and plunder, and engage in illicit and licentious behavior, and all that is despicable, problematic, and shame. Traits of cruelty and fury are aroused in soldiers, even those who are otherwise decent human beings, when they descend upon the enemy. Therefore, the verse admonishes, be on guard against all forms of impropriety.
Okay, so Torah understands human psychology. And this all actually came out to the fore in such a painful way, in such a shocking way, just now in the war in Ukraine. Russian soldiers come, and what do? They become subhuman. They rape and they kill in such a horrible way. And you wonder, are these normal people? Are these demons or are they human? And the answer is, although we don't like hearing this answer, the answer is, I could probably tell you that these are people who have jobs and have families and have spouses back at home in Russia. But the nature of war is that it brings out the worst in people. That's what happens. That's what happens. And you get so full of yourself, and if you're winning, you could kill people, and it could drive you crazy. And it makes you mad. And it makes you start acting like a total animal. The Torah therefore says, be so careful, even when you're dealing with an enemy that you're trying to win over. Still, these are human beings, and the Torah has laws. And this is Torah value number 3, ethical standards on the battlefield. And if you read horrible accounts of what happened to the Israeli prisoners of war, who were captured by the Egyptians or the Jordanians, what type of torture they were put under, they were killed, horrible. These are the 3 values that Judaism has when it comes to war. Okay, sounds good. The question then is, so when do you go to war? When does war become a thing that Judaism says, that Judaism sanctions and says, you gotta go to war? So even though Judaism is all peaceful, like this we see the number 1 priority is peace and diplomacy, and we pursue peace, we love peace, Torah is all about peace, at the same time we are not a pacifist religion. Certain religions, certain philosophies are very pacifist, they're absolutely against the war. Judaism says, no, there's a time when a war is not only something that we could do, maybe you could do begrudgingly, there's a time when the Torah calls it a milchemet mitzvah. And the word mitzvah you're all familiar with. Mitzvah means a good thing. It's a commandment, it's an obligation. War becomes something which now we do full force, and Judaism sanctions it. This becomes a war that Judaism, the force of Torah itself, says, you have to do this. When is that? Let's turn to text 13 on page 62. Let's turn about 10 pages later. Text 13, page 62. Marion, you got the page?
Yes.
So if you're up to it, let's give us a read.
What is considered an obligatory war? A war to defend the Jewish community against an enemy that comes to attack.
There you have it. When there's a Jewish community, and by the way, this is not only Israel, this is anywhere in the world. If there's a Jewish community which is under threat of an enemy, it becomes a mitzvah, an obligation for every single Jew to go and join that battle in defense of a Jewish community. So once an enemy attacks, we must all defend, and it literally becomes a mitzvah. And the Torah calls it milchemet mitzvah. This war is a mitzvah, and the mitzvah becomes something binding upon all Jews. And when I was preparing for this class, I remember that I have a beautiful picture. I want to share this with you. This is my grandfather. In 1962, serving in the IDF. The Rebbe actually told me he should not get married until he serves his entire term in the Israeli army, and he was there for 2 years. If I see my grandfather now, it totally doesn't fit his character to be walking around with a machine gun. But he served for 2 years, and he's very, very proud of it. It's a beautiful picture. And I love also about this picture that you have some religious boys here, you have some not religious. It's a nice mix of Israeli society there. Okay, but it's a mitzvah to join and protect the Jewish community. This brings us to today's question. Okay, so you have to go fight when the enemy attacks. What about a preemptive attack? Okay, as we saw before, the world doesn't really have a standard. The world definitely does not have an ethical standard. The world determines a preemptive attack based on its successes. Oh, it worked, and you discovered a threat once you did it, good. It wasn't a success, we'll condemn it. So we need to have a working understanding of what is an ethical standard. And Judaism comes and tells us the laws of a preemptive strike. What are the conditions that have to be present on the ground where Judaism says, again, not only you could go, but you must go on a preemptive attack against the enemy? And I think there's such a beauty that Judaism is very forceful, very clear, very straight. Judaism is not shaky about it. Maybe you should, maybe you shouldn't. This is a standard. If these factors are present, again, melchemet mitzvah becomes an obligation. Okay, so we're going to read this in 3 different texts. Each text is going to help complement our understanding of Jewish law's position on this. But a little bit of background. The context for these laws, the way we're going to read them right now, is within the laws of Shabbos. So Shabbos, Shabbat, the 7th day of the week, is the Jewish day of rest. Carrying weapons is forbidden on Shabbos. Fighting is against Shabbos, against the spirit of Shabbos, forbidden. Okay. So Jewish law takes Shabbos because Jewish law in general works in the extremes. It always tries to see what's the limitations of a given law. So the context of these laws is Shabbos, when even on Shabbos, Jewish law would say, take arms and go fight, and start a preemptive battle, which means like this. If you're getting attacked, there's no question about it. Then you got to go to war on Shabbos, self-defense. If Jewish lives are at risk, if your own life is at risk, then you have to desecrate the Shabbos. That's a no-brainer. The question is, you are being the aggressor. Could you be the aggressor on Shabbos? That's already a bit of a sticky situation. It's easy to just say, let's just wait 24 hours and then we'll start the war. So Jewish law goes to this type of situation on Shabbos where it's forbidden to act, and when it's forbidden to fight, it's forbidden to carry arms. When would we say that even that? To desecrate Shabbos, to preempt, to start a battle, to start a war, to initiate a war. So 3 texts here. Text 14a, Debbie, we're up to you, right? Okay, page 63, this is from the Talmud.
If Gentiles besiege Jewish cities, we do not initiate a military offensive against them, nor do we desecrate the Shabbat to prepare defense. This rule applies if the enemy's goal is solely monetary. If, however, they threaten lives, we initiate a military offensive against them, and we desecrate the Shabbat if necessary. If the city abuts the border, even if the enemy does not seek to take any lives, rather, they only want to plunder straw and hay, we initiate a military offensive, even if this entails desecrating the Shabbat.
Okay, so we see over here that Jewish law basically gives you 2 times, 2 scenarios, 2 factors. If any of these 2 factors are present, Jewish law says desecrate the Shabbos. And not just to fight a battle of self-defense, initiate a battle of preemption. What are these 2? So the first one is quite obvious. If there is human life at risk. Human life at risk, right? It's a no-brainer, save lives, and you go ahead, and if you hear that there's an enemy who's approaching and they want to kill, you go and you have to act preemptively, even on Shabbos. Okay, that's a no-brainer. But then Jewish law says something very, very interesting. Let's say there's no risk to human life. And in the words of the Talmud, the enemies only want straw and hay. These are not enemies who want our lives. These are just bandits. They're just looters. They just want to take straw and hay, which is basically, items of very little significance. But if it's a border town, that's serious. Don't mess with border towns. If this is a border, we go on anything and begin a preemptive attack, even if they're coming only for our straw and hay. Threat to a border city, we act even if no risk to human life. Okay, so these are the two things, which is very, very interesting. Judaism sees a border town as being an absolute red line. And we don't only defend the border town, but even on Shabbos. Under most situations, if there's no risk to human life, Judaism says, hold your arms, right? Wait till tomorrow. You could give it a few days. We'll deal with it later. Yes?
How do you besiege a city from not a border town?
Oh, how does an army besiege a city not from a border town? That's a very good practical question. Well, so let's give an example from Israel. Let's say there's Bedouins, and they're embedded within the community, within the borders, and they're going and plundering a city. That would be an example. They're just coming and they're stealing stuff. Does that make sense? Nomads, yeah, sort of, yeah. Exactly, yeah. I think that's a fair way to put it. So we're not talking about, to use, to give 1967 analogies. We're not talking about the Egyptians coming on a border. We're talking about somebody internally, not necessarily a big army, but just somebody's coming and looting on Shabbos. So if we're absolutely certain that there's no monetary risk here, that there's no risk to human life, it's only monetary, then we can't act on Shabbos. You could act before Shabbos, you could act right after Shabbos, and that's only for 100% sure there's no risk to human life. Okay. Why is a border town such a sensitive area for Jewish law? Let's read text 14b from the Or Zarura, one of the earliest codifications of Jewish law, very, very important work. And he explains, text 14b, page 64. Go ahead, Stuart.
Halacha views a city alongside the border differently for fear that if the enemy conquers it, it will be a launching pad that will allow them to conquer the entire land with greater ease. There is no difference if the enemy has already besieged the city or if they've only declared their intention to come and plunder the city. As soon as reports arrive that the enemy intends to come and plunder, even though they have not yet arrived, it is permitted to don arms even on Shabbat, be on guard, and mobilize the city residents to prevent the enemy from coming. For when lives are potentially at risk, we do not require absolute proof in order to prompt action.
Okay, so halacha says like this. Border city, that's sensitive. Why? Because the moment that the enemy sees that they are able to even touch and penetrate a border town without resistance, they'll whet their appetite for maybe starting to conquer and take away land. Judaism says, oh, that's a problem. Judaism says, and this is what the Or Zarura says, this text 14b, you don't even need to have concrete proof. The enemy doesn't even need to start mobilizing yet. You just hear about it. The reports arrive that the enemy intends to come and plunder. You bear arms and you begin the process of preventing the enemy from coming. Okay, last text, 614c, and we're back at you, page 65. And I want you to keep in mind everything we're reading here, because I want to now take these texts and start applying them to the practical situation pre the war in 1967. Go for it, Larry.
The Gemara, Irvin 45a, sanctions defensive action on the Sabbath as well as on weekdays against heathens who besiege a border settlement, even though the marauding forces seek only straw and hay. An example, they are intent only upon looting or exacting economic concessions. It is clear that in such situations, there exits no imminent danger. It is not at all certain that any life will be endangered. There is, however, reason to fear that even if the aggressor's immediate pecuniary or economic goals are achieved without resistance, having penetrated border defenses, the enemy may engage in warfare at some future time and thereby endanger Jewish lives. The The loss of fortified border settlements would leave the entire country exposed and defenseless. Hence, defensive measures are warranted.
These three texts captured Judaism's position on when a preemptive attack is not only an option on the table, but Jewish law says you have to go and do this. Preemptive attack. And again, what is that? Risk of loss of life or a threat to a fortified border position. Border position is something that we will not tolerate. Not only are we going to fight to protect it, we will preemptively attack it. Preemptively attack a threat against it. Let us now take Judaism's standard and apply them to the situation before the 1967 Six-Day War. Before the war, there were four main factors at play, and I want to go through all of them with you, and let's think critically. Does this situation fit the criteria of Judaism that says, that's it, we've crossed that line, attack preemptively, or not? If you look in your books on page 66, you will see them here. The four are the closing of the Straits of Tiran, the removal of the UN peacekeeping forces, which acted as a buffer between Egypt and Israel, the massing of Egyptian troops, and the rhetoric and threats coming out of Egypt and from the Arab world. These are all four things that unnerved the Israeli government. But according to Jewish standards, do these justify a preemptive attack? I want you to think about this for a moment. And if you have a pen, either write yes, no, or unsure about each of these four, and then I want to hear some thoughts from you. And on Zoom as well, if you have any thoughts, I want you to speak up. We're going to go through all through these four, somewhat briefly, because we don't have a lot of time to make a long discussion out of this. But let's think critically. From the perspective of Jewish law, do any of these four, or a combination of some of these four, act as a justification that Judaism will say, attack preemptively? Okay, let's begin with the closing of the Straits of Tiran. Again, the Straits of Tiran, they are an economic, a very important economic source for the Israeli community. That's where they get their gas from, international trade, and the Egyptians close it off to Israeli ships. Would you say that that fits the halachic criteria of a pretense for going to battle? Yes? Yes. Who says yes? Yes? By raise of hand, who says yes? Okay, let's see. My hands are down. Okay. So we have a bunch of yeses. One person. Why yes? Anybody? Why yes? Yeah, go for it.
Because it's attached to the enemy who is closing your strait is on your border. They are closing your strait only in a way designed to facilitate that, approaching the border.
So first of all, they're approaching your border. Okay, they're approaching your border. Any other thoughts?
Stranglehold.
It's a stranglehold. It's an economic stranglehold.
They're stealing your hay.
They're stealing your hay. Okay, but they're stealing your hay. Stealing hay is not a justification to go to war. Oh, but it's a border. You could also argue it's not a border. Straits of Tiran are actually very far away from Israel's border. And this wasn't an act against human life. This was an economic thing. You can argue that.
It's your border neighbor that's stealing.
Oh, but it is. That's right. But it is close enough to the border.
But the guy doing it is right on your border.
The guy that's doing it is.
So the guy's there is right on the border.
He's not doing it for nothing.
Stealing your hay.
That's right. Okay. Anybody for no? Any arguments for no? First of all, raise of hand. Does anybody say no that this does not act as a good enough justification? Come on, nobody?
I was unsure.
You're unsure. Okay, that's fair. That's fair. Any no's? And any no's on Zoom? I can't. No no's? Okay.
I'll give you the no.
Give me the no.
They're not stealing your hay. They're preventing you from getting.
Oh, they're not even stealing your hay. They're only right.
They're blocking other people
from sending you hay. Okay, I wonder if that's good enough. Okay.
That's why it was.
You're unsure. All right. Next one. Removal of the UN peacekeeping force. Is that good enough of a reason? Who says yes? First raise of hands. Who says this is a good enough justification? All right. Who says no? That this is not a justification for sending away the forces? And okay, let's start with the yeses. Who wants to argue for a yes? Yes.
Well, first, we know they're coming in over the border. and they're posing a problem.
No, but this is just the act of sending away the buffering, protect peacekeeping
But
force.
it's difficult to answer one question because there are many questions.
You're saying it's all coming together.
The
I hear
same in attacking and the same as not attacking.
Right, but let's look at just at this act. Egypt sends away the peacekeeping force, which act as a buffer, a protective buffer to Israel. Is that itself an act that according to Jewish law, we say, go for it and fight?
Actually, you could say yes, because I was unsure, but could say yes, because Egypt signed a international treaty that it would be a demilitarized zone after the Sinai. They agreed.
That's right, but now they're sending away the force, which seems to be nefarious. Okay, Eli, I saw that you said no. Go ahead and unmute.
All right. Yeah. Okay. So I think that because it's not the act of any of the aggressors directly, it wasn't Egypt, it wasn't Syria, it was the neutral parties, those in the UN that were serving as the intermediary, the protective, source in the middle, departing. The impact of that is, of course, that there's heightened risk for Israel, but it's not an overt act by any of the aggressors.
That's right.
So I don't think it meets
the aggressor is not doing
standard.
anything, right?
Right.
Sorry, yeah. So the aggressor's not doing anything. So the UN, okay, at the same.
You don't have to do anything, you just have to have a report that someone's gonna breach your
Oh,
border.
okay, very good. And Stuart is pointing out to us that if you look at text 14b, it says as soon as reports arrive, the enemy intends to come and plunder.
That's pretty intense.
And it seems that we have that. Okay, and then we have number 3. We have
Couldn't you argue just sending them away is not really threatening your border? It's just saying, maybe we don't need you anymore.
right, but it seems to imply nefarious
Right.
intent. Even if you don't look at anything else and just look at that, it seems to be nefarious. But you could also argue, which is what the Egyptians say, we don't want to attack, we'll only send the UN away. It's like that when Israel attacks us, we'll be able to defend ourselves. So that's how they spun it. Okay, let's go to number 3.
They're not stealing our straw.
Yeah, just tap it.
Right, they're not going for hay yet, and they're not attacking the borders yet.
All you need is a report.
But all you need is a report. That's right. So that's a key line from the text that we read. All you need is a report. Massing of troops. Let's keep on moving along. So the Egyptians then mobilize and they start putting, the entire brigades out in the Sinai Desert. Okay. So what do you say now? Is this good enough of a record? Right. So that seems pretty clear. Yes. Okay. Who says no? Do we have an argument for no? That even the massing of troops is still not good enough of a justification according to Jewish law for going to war. Okay, well, go for it.
Well, it depends on the intent.
It all depends on intent.
Of the massing, right?
So,
I mean,
so,
North
so,
Korea has troops massed all over the border and they don't intend to cross.
right. And the
So-
Egyptians said that also out of one side of their mouth. They were saying, we're just here because we're scared the Israelis are going to attack us. We want to be able to defend ourselves against the Israeli aggression.
It's what you believe their intent is
Right.
what matters.
Right.
The act of amassing intent is the real issue, not the actual act.
Right. But if we feel it's threatening, that there's an enemy threatening, right? Okay, let's go to number 4, the rhetoric and threats. Would you say that is, that when the enemy says clearly that we want to attack and kill you and destroy you and make that Israel should cease to exist, is that good enough of a justification for the Judaism? You say yes. And it seems very, very clear over here. Intent, such clear intent, especially with the mobilization, that really does already fulfill the Jewish requirements. We have these 4 closing straits of Tehran, removal of UN Peace Corps. These guys look really, really helpful, no? They're gonna stop. Okay. The amassing of troops. These are Egyptian tanks on the Sinai, and the rhetoric and threats. If you look at these 4 together, especially the aggregate, I'll get to you in a second, Richard. I think it is very fair to say that this is good enough of a reason to believe that the enemy is serious. They have intent to attack. They're even acting upon that intent. And according to Jewish law, this qualifies as what we will call milchemes mitzvah, a war that is already an obligation, which is why, even according to Jewish law, every single Jew who was able to fight had to be part of the battle. And according to Jewish law, this would be a war that we would have to begin, preemptively attack. Go ahead, Richard.
So my question relates to capability.
Okay.
So just because people say they want to attack
does there need to be some
Foundation in their ability.
some feeling that they could do something successfully?
That's a good question.
For you to, for that to apply, because, you know, otherwise, any anti-Semite who says Israel should die, we are justified to attack and kill them.
So that is fair to say that the intelligence has to feel that this is a credible threat.
Yeah, so it's just, I mean, does that intent, right, there has to be more than just the
Right.
threat. It has to be some sort of.
It has to feel that substantial,
It has to be
that it is
something
real.
backing- well, not just the threat real, the capability
The capability
to
of
actually
it.
do something. I mean, if it's a, you know, a band of 6 people with no weapons making a threat,
That's right.
what's the view on that?
That's right.
That's the question.
I don't know for sure. According to Jewish law, I would believe that would be a consideration. Ultimately, Judaism does say, which is actually very, very interesting, that we do leave it to military professionals, not the political professionals, not to the diplomats. If military professionals feel that this is a threat and that we will be able to save lives, we have to do it. Okay, I don't want to go over time, so I want to have more discussion. I could stay through the night, but I want to start very briefly.
I almost think these 4 Jewish laws give you license to pretty much attack anytime the hell you want.
So it seems like you could do whatever you want. Okay.
Right, I mean, it doesn't, I mean, almost anything could be a prelude to any one of these cases, and you attack. I mean, destroying the nuclear reactor in Iraq, it threatened not only a border town, it threatened everybody.
Right.
You have every right to.
Right.
preempt
So
it.
Judaism does give, I wouldn't say an easy license, but there definitely is the right that you don't have to sit back when there's credible threat. I think Richard's point is true. Doesn't mean they just start shooting at anybody who opens up their mouth. It has to be a credible threat. But this is the I want to read this next text with you, and then we're gonna start wrapping up. And I also want to show you a video before we close up. So okay, we're gonna go a few minutes over. Text 15, and this is a great halakha authority of the modern age. He was a great rabbi in Israel, and this is what he said during the War of Attrition. So this is before the Yom Kippur War. I believe he said this in 1969. Let's read text 15, and Toby, I believe we're by you.
Hypothetically, there are circumstances under which Israel would be forbidden to go to war. In actuality, however, the 3 wars that Israel has waged, the War of Independence, the Sinai Campaign, and the 6-Day War, and the War of Attrition that followed, were fought to defend a Jewish community against an enemy that comes to attack them. This was the situation in all 3 of the wars, and the same is true today. There is no greater obligatory mitzvah war than these.
There you have it. There you have it. That our understanding is that these wars that Israel has fought were not wars of conquering land. That would actually be forbidden according to Judaism, but as a mitzvah. Let's conclude with this last text, and I want to show you a video. Was Israel allowed to attack? The conclusion that we're going to take in today's class is that number 1, they had the intelligence that the attack was imminent and that the attack was credible. And number 2, it was an attack to Israel's very vulnerable borders. And that itself, according to Judaism, you just put those 2 ingredients together, and that is the right. Last text, and this captures the Jewish value and the Jewish law's position. If you gotta go, don't worry. Text 16 on page 68. Go for it, Tom.
The Torah instructs us, if one is coming to kill you, rise up to kill them first.
Kubi, you've heard of the saying? Someone's coming to kill you, rise up to kill him first. Okay. Now I want to show you a 3-minute video from the Rebbe talking. This is a talk from the Rebbe from 1969 during the War of Attrition. And the Rebbe talks about this theme, and the Rebbe says something very interesting about this statement over here. If one's coming to kill you, rise up to kill him first. The Rebbe is going to comment on the fact that it says to, not and. The Talmud doesn't say rise up and kill him. It says rise up to kill him. There's a difference. Okay, so let's watch over here.
Schas me weiß, als do einer, was de bolle Horgo, is demot nie der Seide. Am darf sitzen und warten, bis wann nicht alle Goyim und Maskim sei. Und mit Pasken in dem Dien in einer Sife von 119 Members von Goyim. Also der Goy wird am soll ihm schmeißen. Und unter dem wird machen an der Hilfe von dem Minyaniden, als sie seine Nechet Maske mit den 119 Goyim, nie dass der Seder auf mit dem, was hat, was Abole Horder. Wir darf nur wissen, sie das Abole Horder, weil sie kommen das wissen das von der Mitte. Es kann sein, a Jorat war Hashem, ist ein frommer Gott. Und als er kommt Sonntag, geht in die Bockenpläne und dort misspallen. Und schreibt, dass Morgen gesagt, aber schaß mir der geben Apache Nebenbad, soll sie unterstellen die zweite Bad. Aber das meinten die Mieden, sagt nicht er. Der will geben Pula Stagmel, will schlagen zurück. Habe doch und sie legen das Zesek war Jesche, wie tut das zusammen sagt. Früher bringt dem Dien im Besten. In die UN. Und danach werden sie aufpassen, wie der Ding von dem, was hat geschossen. Und danach wirst du Michel sein uns dem Folgen. Sagt die Tere, nein, nicht dass sie der Seder. Nicht nur, dass sie nicht der Seder verlieren. Dem Goy macht das keine. Aber der Goy weiß, als Bolle Orgel. Und du schickst da rein ein Papier, sich einer, den ich gesagt. Als wieder willst, gehen schlagen an jeden. Soll sie wissen sein, dass das ein gegen dem Charter, bemehle macht früher an Asife und fragt bei sie Arische, wo dem, wo du sich nachts nicht schön geschlagen, mehle verfallen, tak tut Schuhe. Und danach ist das Ball im Molle, zu niederpschat, als sich aufstellen beim Schlagen der Mieden. Als mit dem Zugewinn, als wegschlagen der Mieden, wer schlagt Agoi? Wo denn du es machst, aber Yitzhaku, von was es nicht geschrien, wenn man geschlagen hat jeden? Sie bolle Orgo, hast mit dem nicht was zu teilen. Der erste sagt, dafür sein, Haschkim le Orge. Steht gar nicht Haschkim le Orge, steht da dafür Magen im Befehl. Sieht nicht kommen dazu. Also hat nur sein, du bist zugestanden für Tod. Alminas, als Ebert sich prüfen, Tag le Orge. Ich sag, demol bist du mochen Haschkim le Orge, wird Chatchile nicht gehen zu dir. Ich sag, das ist der Weg, mit welcher sich rechnen. Ich dem schicken Brieflöch und schicken Vorsteher und reden heute Morgen und übermorgen, die alle Wege hat schon nicht geprüft und hat schon auch gekostet, sehr viel Karbonis und es hat gebracht, nicht nur mit Missaken gewesen, es hat Kali gemacht. Worin hat gesehen, als Sover, wie Scholisch, wie Riba, wie Chimisch und sie geht durch. Beschafft aber sein, der Haschkim Lehorge mit der Lamme, wird nicht jetzt sein mit dem Pullen, mit mehr nicht wie das Luftstehen vertog und stehen hoch. Was hat demut in Sof, das die Wosse von dem Mitzrich.
The Jewish perspective is that when you show that you're not timid and that you're going to follow Jewish laws, law, that you need to go and preemptively attack, that itself is deterrence. Strength is the best way for peace. Weakness, and unfortunately, you see this in throughout all the past decades. Every single time the government was weak and undecisive, the enemies right away took that as now we go attack. And we pay with that with Jewish blood. So Torah says, if he's coming to kill you, rise up to kill him, and you won't even need to kill him. It doesn't say and kill him. Okay. One last video I want to show you. This is of a meeting of Major General Yosef Ben Hanan, who was the commander of the IDF Armored Corps, from 1988. He visited the Rebbe, and he had a long relationship with the Rebbe, and in fact, he wanted to resign, and the Rebbe told him, you can't resign, Israel needs you. And he stayed with the idea for many more years after. He has watch it online, he says a story about that. And whoever he answered to in the Israeli army was very upset at him. He says, I tell you that we need you, you don't listen to me. You need to go to New York to some rabbi, and he tells you need to stay in the IDF. And over here you see here, and this is a public talk, so this is a quick public meeting. So they're not getting to anything too in-depth, but I think this video brings out the message of today's class as well. So here we go.
יש לי דרישת שלום לך מכל החיילים בחיל השריון וגם מכל החבורה של נחשון ואביטאור, ואנחנו מאחלים לך אריכות ימים ותמשיך להנהיג אותנו כמו שאתה עושה בכל השאר.
Ich wollte geht sich פעם בעזור לתוארת, אבל בזה שיהיה חזקים כל כך שדי יהיה הפחד שיפחידו, שכנגד שלא יפחידו מלכתחילה להתגרות בישראל. זה הניצחון הכי גדול כשצריך להשיג במלחמה בכלל. בגנרלים צריך לריים. הוא צריך לריים דין. אני רוצה שיהיה שונים בארץ ושונים בכל הארץ.
אבל כשלנו יהיה כוח. כשיהיה לנו את הכוח, אז יהיה לנו את
הכוח. הכוח יש לכם, אבל צריך למצב אותו. כי הכוח מונו בצער, משאים לו לכל משמש, ספסים, יש כוח. אבל זה היפך הכבוד לעשייה שלך. אני רוצה שידור כל זה בפה, אבל זה שלי לספר אפשר מלחמה. בצורות טובות, לפרישת שלום לכל אלו שדרשו בשלום, ואפילו שלי דרשו בשלום.
All right, dear friends. And with that, we conclude tonight's class. Next week, we'll be talking about Jerusalem, the chosen city of Jerusalem. We're talking about the story of the conquest. And till today, our right to Jerusalem is still being contested. In the UN, they voted. There's been a vote. If Israel even has a right, has any ties to Jerusalem. This is a very important topic. Let's discuss the implications of the taking of Jerusalem in the 6-Day War, what it means to us next week, and have a wonderful night. Have a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you for joining and looking forward to seeing you all next week.